Chapter 14, Alaska. Luddites? John said, peering at the screen. A trainee, he showed real promise at scout work, brought in another armful of split wood and pitched a few billets into the wood stove. It thumped and gave a muffled whoosh as he adjusted the air intake, and the day's damp chill receded a bit. "Yes, sir. That's our intel," Jack Brock said. John rolled his eyes. Jack was still completely enamored of military parlance, while John Connor was already sick of it. Better get over that, he thought with resignation. It was going to be the lingua franca for the next 30 years or more. And every calling needs a jargon. It helps the organization's purpose stay sharp and clear. "There must be millions of them," Brock was saying. Connor jerked his mind back to the matter at hand. "Worldwide," he agreed. "Hundreds of thousands at least." He sat forward. "Good work, Jack. Congratulate Reese and Susie for me on a job well done. Out." "Thanks, John. Will do. Out." Luddites. He'd known that Skynet had human assistance, but he'd never expected it to come from that quarter. The progress-hating, machine-scuttling, science-despising Luddites would seem to be the last people Skynet could get to help it, and yet they share a lot of the same goals, namely reducing humanity in population and power. Of course, I don't think that most Luddites want to reduce humanity to zero. But there would be some who would. He winced. Wendy would have hated this. Connor moved out onto the now bustling floor of the once abandoned building that his mother had acquired. It had originally been HQ and smelter for a series of gold dredges. They'd spent a lot of time and money improving the building from the inside before Judgment Day. Outside, they were well disguised as a semi-dilapidated series of aging buildings of unpainted pine. Inside, they were weather-tight and roomy enough to provide barracks, offices, training areas, a canteen, and hardened storage for tons of electrical equipment. Still, John went home occasionally. He needed his alone time. But it made his heart swell with pride to see the people they'd recruited before Judgment Day pitching in and recruiting people themselves. The resistance was really shaping up. It helps that we're not coming from behind this time, he thought. They'd drained Dieter's freely given fortune to build this, exploited his every contact and resource, and it was paying off visibly. Now they were in a kind of race to see if they could prevent Skynet from building its army, or at least defeating it far sooner than they had the first time. Would that mean that Kyle Reese would never be born, or that having been born, he'd never be sent into the past? Will I disappear mid-sentence one day? John wondered. Who cares? What's one life if I can save millions by giving mine? He'd never liked the idea that he was destined to send his father to his death. If he could prevent that by ceasing to exist, well, c'est la guerre. He grinned. It isn't like I'd know. Comodoro Rivadavia, Argentina. I'm not asking for anything like your full production, Sarah said. I'm only asking for a slight increase to those countries you've already been supplying. But all to the advantage of the United States, Senor Rima said. Do we really wish to see the United States once again so powerful? Sheesh, Sarah thought. To hear people down here talk, you'd think we were the Roman legions, invading everywhere, stealing everything that wasn't nailed down, including the people, and then pretending it was a good deal because one day the remaining folks would be citizens. We have our faults, God knows, but we weren't that bad. Sarah's Spanish was virtually accent-free, with a tinge of Paraguay and Nicaragua, and she seldom bothered to mention that she was from California. It simplified things. Unfortunately, it was impossible to get this business done without being a bit more upfront. For a moment, she looked out the window, controlling her temper. Comodoro was on the northern edge of Patagonia. Steep ground fell to the cold-looking grey water, and oil storage tanks and pipelines and refinery cracking towers were everywhere. There wasn't much of a tang in the air because the wind blew constantly. She'd considered hiding out around here when she was on the run with John after the attack on Cyberdyne, but the perpetual howling and the bleak, flat landscape didn't appeal to her. Comodoro's other buildings were mostly medium-size and flat-roofed. One of the bigger ones had a 10-story-high colored Coke ad, something that sheep ranchers came miles to see. And they have to sell the oil, she told herself. Argentina hadn't been badly hit, no actual nuclear bombs, yet. That didn't prevent economic collapse, riots, regional warlordism, and general crisis. She'd have preferred to deal in Venezuela, but the Maracaibo fields there had been major enough to be on a target list. It is unlikely that the United States will ever be that powerful again, she said aloud. In the meantime, there are people there that need our help. And there are opportunities here for those with the vision to take them. South America is in a position to take its place as a world leader. Rima looked thoughtful. But which South American country shall lead? That is the question. Long training kept Sarah from rolling her eyes and yelling, "No, it's not, you idiot!" The United States never would have gotten powerful enough for morons like this one to resent it if the big question had been, which state is going to be the most important? No wonder Simón Bolívar, South America's equivalent to George Washington, had died despairing and saying his career had been like trying to plow the sea. Things would have been tougher still, of course, if the early Americans had had Skynet to contend with instead of just the British. But telling Senor Rima about a great computer menace would certainly end this already shaky interview. Poor bastard, she thought. Sooner or later, Skynet's going to come after you too, with nukes or plagues or HKs or all of the above. She'd worked her way from Mexico to near the tail of Argentina, reaffirming arrangements for food and other supplies to be shipped to their resistant cells in the United States. But suddenly some people she already had contacts with had begun to object that she didn't represent the US government, which was weird because she'd never claimed to. Since whipping out a pistol and blowing them away was not going to help, Sarah had applied diplomacy and the occasional, all right, more than the occasional bribe. Oddly enough, it was the criminals who had been most likely to stick to their agreements. But then they knew she might whip out a pistol and blow them away. The certain knowledge that it was a possibility kept things conveniently civilized. Not to mention that they knew she had backup who'd rescue her, or at least avenge her death. Which was especially useful because she was a woman trying to work within a very macho society. The wise criminal knew that a gun didn't care if its user wore nail polish and perfume. But a lot of the politicians and businessmen she'd dealt with were sexist goons who, if she drew down on them, might well mention how big the gun looked in her dainty little hand. So far, though, in spite of complications, her success rate had been pretty high. But fuel was the crucial element, and that was hard to pry out of the hands of oil men. particularly those who suddenly saw themselves as world leaders. If only she could tell them that they were in more danger than they imagined. But Skynet wasn't ready to make its move yet, so any attempt to reveal its evil plans would get her laughed out of South and Central America, and possibly right into another mental institution. Never thought I'd wish to see a Terminator, Sarah thought. But I really, truly wish one would crash in here right now and smack the smirk off Rima's fat face. Rima's assistant burst in from the outer office, his dark eyes shining. "Sir, an American submarine has just entered the harbor." Even better than a Terminator, Sarah thought, though she was impressed by the timing. This might actually be something she could use. Assuming she could prevent the Argentine government from seizing it. By mutual agreement, she and Rima ended the meeting, scheduling their discussion for another day. Captain Thaddeus Chew was not happy. He hadn't been happy since he'd disobeyed Admiral Reed's orders to report to the nuclear cinder that was San Diego. Reed had answered Chew's every request for confirmation with the proper codes, and the voice was definitely the Admiral's. Other officers had agreed with Chew about that. But they too had noticed something not quite right with the way he spoke. Something besides his insane order to commit suicide. In addition, Chew had mentioned a civilian broadcast by a woman named Sarah Connor, who had described the situation with terrifying accuracy. Unbeknownst to the general public, every Navy ship recently refitted with a complex new cyber brain had found itself firing missiles with no executive orders to do so, and wandering the sea lanes helplessly as their crews starved. His old lady had been at the bottom of the list to be refitted. She was an Ohio-class missile sub, originally equipped with Trident missiles, but converted to a commando carrier with 100 SEALs aboard. They would have been in San Diego when the bombs dropped, but for an accident that had required fairly extensive patching, delaying their departure from Okinawa for a critical 2 weeks. Chew had been looking forward to having a better job done at the naval facility in California. Now it looked like she'd bear those scars on her nose for the rest of her days. And yet he was grateful for that accident. Though he pitied those who'd lost family in California, he was not sorry to be alive. They were all but out of food now, and other sundries. Most West Coast ports in the United States were so much rubble, and what research could be done from the ship indicated that the East Coast wasn't much better. Nor were the coasts in China, Japan, Russia, or Europe. South America, however, had possibilities, which was why they were here in Comodoro Rivadavia. Major city, good port facilities, and a history of friendly relations with the United States. Not that that necessarily meant much in these post-nuclear Holocaust days. Bob Vaughan, the XO, knocked and stuck his head through the door of Chew's ready room, which was about the size of a walk-in closet. A submarine was still a sub, even if it displaced as much as the HMS Dreadnought. "There's a delegation from the city to see you, Captain." "Right there," Chew said. He sat for a moment, collecting his thoughts, then picked up his hat and followed the executive officer up on deck. He'd decide about letting people through the hatchway later. Waiting on the dock were a number of impatient-looking men in good suits, and one guy in a military uniform with some very impressive medals on his chest. They looked up at Chew, obviously waiting for an invitation. The temperature was chilly enough to make you remember that the seasons were reversed in this southern hemisphere, not to mention the gunk still circulating in the upper atmosphere. No honor guard or such like, Chew thought. He was surprised. They looked like the kind of men who enjoyed ceremony. He walked down to the end of the gangway, which did have armed guards, his own men, and nodded to the delegation. "Gentlemen," the captain prompted. "We'd like a few words with you, Captain," a particularly sleek specimen said in excellent English. Chu wasn't sure if the question was a request for his name or confirmation of his rank. Both, probably. "I'm Thaddeus Chu," he said, "Captain, USS Roosevelt, and I'll be happy to speak to you gentlemen. You're welcome to board, but I must remind you that if you do come aboard, you are entering United States territory." The delegation stared up at him for some time without moving or speaking. Then their spokesman, who had not deigned to identify himself, took a step forward. "You must know, Mr. Chu," he said with a frown that probably hid some inward glee, "that the United States has effectively ceased to exist." "It's Captain Chu, sir, and you may find that assessment to be premature." Come, Captain. The US is all but hammered flat, in all probability never to rise again. If you didn't think so yourself, you wouldn't have stopped here." He gave the captain a smug smile. "Now would you?" Chu looked down at him with a sinking heart and a poker face. He honestly hadn't expected it to be easy, but he'd hardly expected them to be so blatant. "You are welcome aboard, gentlemen, with the understanding that upon boarding, you are in US territory." The men on the dock looked at one another and conferred quietly. Then the spokesman stepped forward once more. "Perhaps we should leave you to contemplate your options, Captain," he said. He gestured towards the mouth of the harbor. Chu's eyes widened as he watched a huge oil tanker slide in place behind the Roosevelt. He turned to stare at the grinning men on the dock. "Just send us a message when you're prepared to be reasonable." The man waved affably, and the whole group turned and walked away. The captain crossed his arms over his chest and watched them go in disbelief. When he'd pulled into this berth, his biggest worry had been how he was going to pay for supplies. Now he was faced with capitulation to as yet unknown terms, or doing something pretty vile. Though with 100 SEALs aboard, he should be able to limit any necessary damage. But damn, I don't want to go down in history as a pirate. Nor did he want to be remembered for simply surrendering his ship. His father had arrived in the United States from South Vietnam via a rickety boat and a stiff brush with Thai pirates. He didn't intend to start the family saga over again in Latin America. "Reasonable, my royal Asian American ass," he thought, and turning went below. "Get me Commander Smith," he half snarled. Sarah watched the show through binoculars. Commodoro fortunately had a nice selection of high places from which to view all the kingdoms of the earth, or at least of Patagonia. She didn't need to be a lip reader to work out what had happened. As soon as she'd seen that tanker on the move, she'd guessed how this conference was going to end. The sub was neatly trapped, and there wasn't a lot the captain could do about it. Nothing civilized anyway. Clearly, they needed help. Sarah turned and walked away. She had a number of arrangements to make and information to acquire. And I'm not all that civilized either, she thought. After a cheerless supper of steamed rice and water, Chu had retired to his cabin to consider his options, the prospect of which made him glad of his bland meal. He had decided not to allow shore leave as he'd originally planned, in hopes of allowing the men to find their own more substantial dinners. It was a sure bet that any American leaving the Roosevelt would be immediately arrested. Of course, then at least they'd get a square meal. There was a tap at the door. "Enter!" Chu called out. "Sir," his XO said, "there's a message for you, but you'll have to take it at the decoder terminal." The captain raised his brows. It was a rare message that couldn't be patched through to his quarters. "A message from command?" "No, sir. It's being transmitted via the hydrophones, modulated sonic from outside the hull, expertly blurred. The sonar watch can't give a location." "Who is it from?" he asked, with a spurt of well-concealed alarm. "If the locals have frogmen outside the hull with limpet mines, we are fucked." The younger man looked at Chu and swallowed, more emotion than he usually showed in a week. "She says she's Sarah Connor, sir. The message could be coming from anywhere." Chu rose and followed his second-in-command down the narrow corridor. Avoiding the narrow bits that stuck out and that could tear your uniform or bang your elbow, and color-coded conduits, was second nature, but he did appreciate shoreside fresh air. The big boomers didn't develop a ripe stink like the old-time pig boats, but things did get sort of stale after a few weeks submerged. "And sailors get sort of thin without food," he thought grimly. "Let's hope this Sarah Connor can help." Sarah floated beside the sub, waiting to hear from the captain. It would have been dark 15 feet down in daylight, and this was well after sunset. The water was cold, but her wetsuit made it tolerable. She didn't think she'd need to worry about anyone on board finding her here. They were being carefully watched from the harbor and from the oil tanker, and at the first sign that the sub might be deploying sailors, there'd be trouble. Her expensive face gear would allow her to speak to them as though she were on dry land. Eventually they'd figure out that she was right beside the sub, but probably not until she'd swum away. "This is Captain Thaddeus Chu of the USS Roosevelt. Please identify yourself." Her lips quirked, not a request. "This is Sarah Connor," she said. "You may have heard my broadcast." "Yes, ma'am." Damn, it did sound like her. "What is it you want?" "To help. Down coast at Puerto Deseado, there's a cache of supplies waiting. You'll have to pick them up yourselves. I'll be there waiting for you." "Thank you, ma'am," Chu said. "But we have a small problem here. Which you may have noticed since it's as big as a city block and sitting on my back." "It's being taken care of, Captain. Be prepared to move momentarily. Connor out." "Ma'am?" Chu said. He looked at the radio man. "She's gone, sir." Chu looked up and met Bob Vaughan's eyes for a long moment. Then he shrugged. "If worst comes to worst, we've had a drill. If we're lucky and the lady is as good as her word, we're back in business. Status?" "Ready to go, sir, as per your orders." That was one good thing about a nuke boat. As long as you kept the reactor hot, you were ready to roll whenever you wanted, and you didn't have to worry about wasting fuel much. Sarah swam off, guided by an occasional glimpse at the GPS compass on her wrist, confident in the knowledge that she'd hired the best pirates that pure gold could buy. She'd left them scaling the side of the huge tanker. They were well armed and quite capable of capturing the small band of soldiers aboard, and two of them could pilot the tanker if no crew had been left aboard. She popped up on the far side of the harbor, well away from the lights the army had set up. Her battered jeep, driving something too desirable, like a Humvee, was asking for trouble, and clothes were all as she'd left them. Something very loud and unfortunate would have happened if anyone had tried to lift them. The pebble beach was rough under her hands and knees as she leopard crawled up from the waves, and the air was cold on her naked flesh as she peeled out of the synthetic fabric and quickly donned her clothes, shivering and stamping. The high-tech binoculars came next. There was nothing she could do to make the operation go better at this point. God, she thought suddenly. All these years. I wonder how Sarah Connor, the student and waitress, would have felt. Men may be dying out there because of me, and I'm completely calm about it now. Then she shrugged. This was how it had to be if Skynet was to be beaten. What had that German philosopher that Dieter had told her about said? He who fights dragons becomes a dragon. No muzzle flashes through the binoculars, though. She switched to thermal imaging. They've got her engines hot. She could see the heat plumes from the stack at the rear, and more faintly as a blob of different color on the side of the hull at the stern. The tanker wasn't a supergiant, which would have used steam turbines and taken a long time to move. It was a medium-sized job, used to shuffle refined products along the coast, about 50,000 tons, powered by big diesels. You could fire up right away. It was even remotely modern. The whole process could be controlled from the bridge at a pinch. Yep, there she goes. So slowly that at first it didn't seem that she was moving at all. The tanker had backed halfway to its own berth before the soldiers on shore realized what was happening, and the sub had begun its turn away from the dock. It maneuvered cautiously. Ohio-class boats were a good 560 feet long, but swiftly, backing and then heading for the entrance to the harbor with a rush that sent a smooth black wave breaking into foam. Sarah grinned as she gathered her diving gear and tossed it in the back of her Jeep and vaulted into the driver's seat. She had a sub to meet. The only good thing you could say about Puerto de Suedo was that it was more picturesque than Comodoro's tangle of refinery tanks. Which isn't saying much, Sarah Connor thought. Well, all right, the turn-of-the-century architecture was interesting. More important for her purposes, the local government hadn't broken down. There weren't many bandits in the area around it, and the food was reasonably cheap, particularly if you liked mutton, because the estancias all about had lost their markets. Sarah was thoroughly sick of it, enough so that the sight of the piled carcasses was faintly nauseating, though she'd long ago overcome any city girl squeamishness about butchering livestock or game. Still and all, the sailors will be glad to get it, she thought. The carcasses were as the trucks had left them, not entirely sanitary, but needs must, and the weather was cold enough that they wouldn't go bad in a day or two. She'd gotten sacks of flour as well, and canned vegetables from the Chubut Valley. She sat atop the pile of boxes and watched the sub rise, gleaming from the waves through her binoculars. Teams of men emerged and began to inflate rafts and to put them overside. Then some dropped into the sea beside them. They and the men still aboard the sub maneuvered engines onto the craft, climbed aboard the Zodiacs, and headed for the shore. She could see the night vision apparatus on their faces and wondered if they'd spotted her yet. The men were well trained and efficient. Deploying the inflatables with the engines had taken only a little more than 5 minutes, and some of that had been because the rafts needed time to inflate. Oh, this is a happy day for the resistance, she thought. 100 trained SEALs, the rest of the crew, the sub herself. They were armed, and going by the position of their heads, they most definitely had seen her. Sarah smiled grimly. Technology was a wonderful thing, when it was on your side. She slid down from the top of the pile and stood waiting for the Zodiacs to beach themselves. One of the men trotted up to her, young, hard, fit in camo fatigues and body armor, face hard to see behind the goggles. "Are you Sarah Connor?" he asked. She nodded, then said, "Yes, and I'd like to speak to your captain, if you wouldn't mind." "Sarah Connor would like to speak to the captain," he said. She blinked, then realized he was wearing a throat mic, almost invisible in the dark. "The captain would like me to bring you now, ma'am," the sailor said. "Let's fill the raft with supplies," she said. "No need to waste fuel." The sailor relayed that, then nodded and grabbed a sack of rice. Sarah followed suit, and in short order they had the Zodiac filled to capacity and were on their way, cold salt spray flicking into their faces. Looking up at the conning tower, she saw two shadowy figures outlined against the night sky, above the diving planes. "Permission to come aboard," she called softly. "Permission granted, Miss Connor," Chu said. "Welcome aboard." It wasn't until he'd sat at his desk that he realized exactly how small she was. Somehow, he'd been expecting an Amazon, 6 feet tall or more, and pumped with muscle. Although, for a middle-aged lady, she was, in fact, quite muscular, and moved with the ease of one who kept very fit. He gestured her to a chair, and she gave him a polite smile and sat. "Thank you for your help, Miss Connor," he said. "It was my very great pleasure," she answered. "Throwing a spoke in Signor Rima's training wheels has made my day." "Rima?" "The shark in the sharkskin suit," Sarah told him. "The one who, no doubt, arranged to fence you in. He annoys me." She sat straighter, leaning slightly forward. "But let's get down to business." "I might have known," Chu said ruefully. He folded his hands on his desktop. "This is a U.S. Navy vessel, Ms. Connor. Neither my crew nor I have any business doing anything with it without orders." Sarah looked away and nodded slowly, then looked at him from the corners of her eyes. "Are you going to try to tell me that whenever you've come in hailing distance of any other United States Navy vessels, it's been a peaceful, brotherly encounter?" He blinked before he could stop himself and smiled at her knowing smile. Although how could she have known that when he refused the order to report to San Diego, his ship had immediately begun drawing fire from other Navy ships? That was beyond him. One, a brand new Los Angeles-class boat, had fired a nuclear-tipped homing torpedo towards them, nearly destroying the Roosevelt. But he knew that the crew had not done it. Calls from the captain's private cell phones had warned him that they had lost control of their ships. Once refitted, they'd been stripped to skeleton crews, and it turned out that none of the men and women aboard had the technical knowledge that would have allowed them to take over the computer-controlled vessels. They'd also found out too late that the computers were very well defended with an impressive battery of automatic weapons. Chu stared at Sarah Connor. How could she possibly know? She stared back at him, her expression sad and a little tired. She shook her head and brushed her hair back. "It really doesn't matter how I know," she said, startling him again. "What matters is that my information is solid." The captain's aide came in with a tray bearing 2 bowls of chicken soup and hot biscuits. "I'm cool," Sarah said when he tried to lay the bowl at her side of the desk. "Why don't you enjoy that?" The aide glanced at Chu, who nodded, And smiling, he picked up the tray and began to leave. Talon, Chew said. He pushed the little basket of rolls towards him. Take a couple of these. Thank you, sir. The aide took 2 and left. Chew looked at Sarah, who smiled. Enjoy, she said. Thank you again for this, ma'am. The captain dug in. He could practically feel the hot soup giving him strength. We were pretty much down to our belts. She grinned briefly, then grew very serious. Not to spoil your meal, Captain, but I do have some very bad, if not fully unexpected, news for you. And that would be? Chew asked. There is no federal government anymore. The captain continued to spoon up soup as he thought about what she'd just said. Then he dabbed at his lips with a napkin. With respect, ma'am, there's no way you could know one way or another. With a sigh, she laid it down for him. Skynet. You must have heard of it. At his nod, she went on. It controlled everything. Ships, planes, missiles, and... She tipped her head forward. All bases and bunkers. As soon as the missiles started going up, the heads of the government and many of the best minds in the country were hustled to air-conditioned safety in the deepest, hardened bunkers on the planet. And since that sorry day, not one of those people has been seen alive, and they never will be. The damn computer has run mad, Captain. We didn't send those missiles aloft, and your fellow captains haven't been hunting you down of their own free will, and you know it. At the very least, you must suspect it. He didn't answer as he split a biscuit, then bit into one flaky half. Sarah Connor was a very disconcerting woman. Half the time she seemed to be reading his mind. The rest of the time she was telling him things that rang horribly true. Why don't we just cut to the chase here? He said. What exactly do you want, ma'am? I want you to serve the people of the United States who desperately need your help. She smiled to see him blink. Things are worse than you think, she said. The bombs were just phase 1. Since then, people have been rounded up, ostensibly at the behest of the government, and put in relocation and reconstruction camps. Chew frowned. That doesn't sound quite right, he said. But it doesn't seem altogether unreasonable either. Which is why so many have gone along with it, Sarah said agreeably. In many of these camps, the inmates have been deliberately infected with diseases such as cholera, or they're being forced to work under dangerous conditions with inadequate food and shelter. Men and women in that uniform are doing these things. He tilted his head towards her. Men and women in this uniform, as distinguished from those who are actually in the military. Sarah leaned forward. No doubt you've heard of Luddites. He looked troubled, but nodded. Apparently some of them have been preparing for these times with an eye towards reducing the human population on this planet. They're dedicated, well-organized, and well-supplied. God knows how many deaths they're responsible for so far, or how many they'll be responsible for before they've killed themselves. By us? Chew asked. Because, I'm not going to send my people out to fight without proof of what you're saying. Sarah looked at him for a long time before she spoke. Once again, it's Skynet I'm talking about. It's an amazing computer, she said. There's never been anything like it before, and I hope to my soul there never will be again. The damn thing has become sentient, and it's decided that we are a danger to it, and therefore we must be eliminated. Proof, Ms. Connor, Chu said. Surely you heard about all those cars and trucks running amok, she asked. Of course, but... Sarah sighed deeply. Skynet was originally created by Cyberdyne Corporation. Cyberdyne created the first fully automated factory. Then somehow the plans for those factories became public knowledge and they proliferated all over the planet like some kind of fungus. And in each and every factory, Skynet had a root. It hid programming in every car, truck, and tractor produced over the last 2 years. As the time approached for the government to give it control of all military operations, it began to experiment, sending orders to its various components, taking control from their drivers, and causing thousands of accidents. I researched this. I can give you a disc on it. She watched him slowly absorb what she'd said. Incidentally, it can imitate voices perfectly. Kurt Weimeister programmed it. You may not recognize the name, but he was a master of programming. He extrapolated from voice recognition to voice imitation, right down to characteristic phrasing. Wrote several illegal articles on the subject. I know they're illegal because I know he signed a secrecy contract with the government regarding his work. So, if you've been getting messages from well-known people, the president, some admiral, whatever, that was Skynet. Chu nodded slowly, thinking about the strange way Admiral Reed had been talking the last time they spoke, on the day the bombs came down. His eyes flashed on her. Yet, this is still not proof. No, she said sadly. The proof is that I'm not asking you to do anything illegal or against the interests of the United States. I'm asking you to place yourself, your crew, and your ship at the disposal of what we're calling the Resistance. Who exactly are you resisting? Chu asked. Skynet, the Luddites, and all too soon, whatever machinery Skynet will be producing in its automated factories. The captain studied her. She seemed quite sane, clear-eyed, and intelligent. And given what he and his men had been through during the past few weeks, her story held together amazingly well. Be honest, he thought, at least with yourself. Her story holds together better than anything you've thought of yourself. I need to think about this, ma'am, he said aloud. God, I would hope so, Sarah said. While you're thinking about it, may I suggest you turn this baby around and head for Alaska. You'll find a perfectly friendly port there, and we're hardly touched by the bombs. And I would very much like to travel with you. Chu tipped his head. And? She smiled at him. And at the moment it's the headquarters for the Resistance. If we were to accept this proposal of yours, he said, I assume I would be under your command. You'd be under John Connor's command, my son. He's the only alternative to Skynet. But for now, we'd be under the Commander-in-Chief's mom's command, right? Right. Just so I know where I stand, ma'am. Alaska. John moved his pointer over a topographical map as he outlined the plan of attack. 40 grim-faced men and women watched him, some taking notes. One woman looked both surprised and amused. He wasn't used to talking to large groups of people, yet, and still found his heart pounding whenever he faced an audience. It wasn't made easier by having his newly inducted girlfriend find the whole thing amusing. Cut her some slack, he told himself. she might just be nervous. Sometimes he found himself almost convulsed with inappropriate laughter when he was nervous. And the kind of attention these people gave him, the sheer focus they put into listening to his every word, was extremely nerve-wracking, especially for someone raised to avoid the limelight. Sometimes he felt naked up here. Ninel wrinkled her nose at him, and with an effort of will, he ignored her. It was too soon to include her on this mission, he knew, but he wanted to convince her to spy on her Luddite friends for him, and he didn't think she'd do that without some evidence that it was necessary. Or at the very least, that my organization has a reason to exist and that I'm not a fascist asshole. John ceded the floor to the leader of the scouting party. Trucks arrived and departed at 4-hour intervals, night and day, he said. We have no way of knowing what was delivered or if the trucks left full or empty, as they were tied down all around or were actual 18-wheelers. There was a stir at that. The big transport trucks had gone from the roads since Judgment Day. We saw no humans in the vicinity, nor did we find any sign of automated defenses, though we did find security cameras and microphones. Most were quite obvious. There were several tiers of laser traps around the immediate facility. Other than that, the area seemed clear. John had worried about that. It could be arrogance on Skynet's part, ignorance, or a trap. And yet, trap or not, it had to be dealt with. He stood up as the scout finished. Get some rest, he ordered. We move out at 0200. He nodded to them and left the die, heading for Ninel. She rose, smiling, and came to him. You almost made me break up, you little skunk, he murmured. I can't help it, she said with a little shrug. Extreme seriousness in other people has always given me the giggles. He smiled and shook his head. You stay with me tomorrow. I wondered what I was supposed to do, Ninel said. Everyone else seemed to know exactly where they were supposed to be and what to do, but no one said anything to me. I was starting to think that I was going to be left behind. He started walking towards his office. The truth is, you're not ready for a mission like this, he told her, smiling at her expression of surprise. Not least because your attitude seems to be that we're all off our collective rockers. I need to show you that this is real, he explained, stopping to look down at her. This is a real enemy we're fighting, one that wants us all dead. Ninel tightened her lips and looked down. I know, he said, smiling. I needed proof myself once. He became solemn again. Tomorrow you'll have yours.